Yo guys, what is up? Max in our video, and today we're talking about the Diablo 4 patch notes that just dropped. Now, these are patch notes in response to the player feedback that was received during the early access and open beta periods. We've got changes to class balance, to dungeons, and so much more. I'm going to read through everything you guys need to know. I'll also have a link in the description if you want to check out the patch notes for yourself. Let's get right into the video. So to start us off, we've got some big changes to the dungeons. Now, these changes were made based off of player feedback that basically was saying that dungeons felt tedious and that there was a lot of backtracking to do, and there was like annoying things where you would miss like one animus, which was like the resource you needed to deposit, or you needed to kill all the monsters and you couldn't find the last one. So these are all changes to make the dungeon experience more fluid and more engaging. So to start us off, they've changed the dungeon layouts for a lot of the dungeons to reduce the amount of backtracking that you might have to do. The dungeons should be a little bit more streamlined in your like progress through them. In addition, they've increased the chance for random dungeon events to happen. These were kind of the events that would occur when you were like opening a chest and like all of a sudden a bunch of enemies would spawn. That was originally a 10% chance for it to happen. Now it'll be a 60% chance. So these events should be happening pretty regularly in your dungeons to add more like variability to your gameplay. In addition to that, they've made some gameplay changes. So to start us off, these are dungeon specific gameplay changes. In a like kill all monster quest in dungeons, like straggling enemies will now seek you out instead of being like hidden in a corner in a small corner of the map that you haven't explored. They will actually come and try to find you. So that should like help with that. In addition, when you're gathering animus in the dungeons, you'll get 10 resources and reduce your cooldowns every time you gather them. They reduced all of the like channel times to like deposit animus, to rescue NPCs. They've like made those all like a 0-second animation. While carrying any of the objectives in a dungeons, aka the bloodstones, mechanical boxes, stone carvings, you're going to get a 25% movement speed increase so that you can pick up those objects and bring them to where you're supposed to deposit them much faster. When you open a door in a minimap, it'll generate a ping, aka like if you're in a dungeon with people and they open a door, it'll ping you basically, or get a ping to show that people are moving on in the dungeons, which is also really great. And now all structure objects in dungeons now have additional combat mechanics players must overcome. So maybe, I'm assuming that kind of means like some more traps and stuff in the dungeons. Next up, we get to class balance and changes, and this is where things get really interesting. So to start us off, they've got some general, like all class things. Those all class things is that stun and freezes can be applied to elite monsters twice as long now. They reviewed the class skills to confirm that all classes have access to sufficient skills that remove control impairing effects. So all classes should be able to get out of CCs. And many legendary powers have had updates to their effectiveness, aka they've buffed some legendary powers to make more things viable. So now we get into class specifics. To start us off, the Barbarian. A flat 10% passive damage reduction has been added for the Barbarian class. Some skill tree passives have had their damage reduction effects reduced to compensate. Barbarian was feeling very squishy early on, squishier than the other classes because you had to play melee, and melee wasn't great against a lot of the early bosses, so they're getting flat 10% passive damage reduction to help with that. Next up, Whirlwind didn't feel super great early. It felt really good once you got like a lot of gear for it, but they're buffing Whirlwind. Whirlwind skill now does more damage and consumes more fury. I've been toying around with the idea of going a Whirlwind Barb on launch, so this is actually really awesome because I think Whirlwind was already quite strong once you had the gear for it. Next up, a double swing skill enchantment refunds its full fury cost when used on stunned or knocked down enemies. Some nice quality of life stuff for the Barbarian. Now we get to the Druid. Druid companion skills will now deal heavily increased damage. The companion skills, little lackluster. Again, once you got legendary effects for them, they became quite strong. You had like companion skills one-shotting elites, but they're now going to be dealing heavily increased damage. So companion druids could be also really strong. All ultimate skills for the druid have had their cooldowns reduced. That's also really nice. Usability improvements have been made to maul and pulverize, and using a non-shapeshifting skill will transform a druid back into their human form. That's kind of an interesting change. Should be a little bit more dynamic when playing, and also you're going to want to be more careful with the skills you use to stay in your shapeshifting forms. Gonna be honest here, I think these changes to Druid are good changes. Druid is the class that I would like to play on launch, and so seeing buffs to it is great because I didn't love the leveling experience as a Druid. However, I would have loved to see some improvements slash buffs to the storm skills, the early game core skills, particularly tornadoes and the skill that called down lightning. I thought both of those felt pretty lackluster early on, and I felt like I kind of had to use the more so like maul pulverize skills just because of how strong they were in comparison. So yeah, good changes to Druid, but we'll see how it plays out. Next up, we've got the Necromancer, and we're starting with a bit of a nerf. Summoned minions will die more often, requiring players to utilize corpses more often. This means that your minions will be a little bit weaker, they'll die more often, you'll need to summon them more often. This could be a benefit in the later game. We already saw some like late game items that have effects when your minions die, so could be a positive, could be a negative, but you're going to have to be summoning more minions early game. Next up, the Book of the Dead. The bonuses in it, a lot of their bonuses have had their stats increased. This is a nice little buff for the Book of the Dead. This was like the Necromancer's kind of like class skill in that you could pick out your minions and the buffs that they would get. Damage dealt by Corpse Explosion skill has been reduced. So Corpse Explosion is getting a nerf, and the brightness of the Skeletal Warriors and Mages has been reduced. Lead to some more visibility. Next up, we get to the Rogue, and we're starting with Subterfuge skills. These are the trap skills, like Poison Trap, things like that, have had their bonuses increased. So a nice little buff to those skills. Sometimes it was hard to justify using them. Next up, multiple passive skills have had their bonuses increased. So the Rogue is getting buffs to their trap skills and to some of their passives. However, all imbuement skills have had their cooldowns increased. The Shadow Imbue on Rogue was possibly one of the best skills in the entire beta, having like a 10-second cooldown, giving you extra damage, tons of AoE, and like free vulnerability procs on literally everything. So those imbuement skills are having their cooldowns increase. Now, this could be quite a change for the Rogue depending on how big those cooldowns are. I'm assuming that they're going to be significantly weaker for early game, but once you start building cooldown on your gear, you're probably able to get it down to exactly what the cooldown was before, if not easier. So we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, those imbuement skills like Shadow Imbue, Poison Imbue will have increased cooldown at launch. Next up, we're on to the Sorcerer, who's had some buffs and nerfs. So to start us off, Charge Bolt's damage was increased and the mana cost to cast has decreased. This skill was completely overshadowed by things like Chain Lightning, so Charge Bolt is getting a significant buff. Next up, speaking of Chain Lightning, they decreased the damage of Chain Lightning and reduced its effectiveness against bosses. This skill was a do-it-all skill for the Sorcerer. For bossing and mobbing, you would throw it into groups and it would kill all the mobs. And then if you got close enough to a boss, you could kind of just spam it and it would chain back and forth, dealing crazy damage. So Chain Lightning has been nerfed. Next up, they decreased the cooldown for the Incinerate skills, enchantment bonus. If you don't remember Incinerate, that was the like channel fire spell, and its enchantment bonus was a serpent will incinerate enemies every 20 seconds. This has been buffed, so a serpent will come and incinerate enemies sooner. They didn't say like exactly how many seconds, but that is buffed. Next up, firewalls will now spawn underneath enemies more frequently when using its enchantment bonus. Firewall was going to be spawning on enemies at a 5% chance to spawn 2 firewalls underneath an enemy. I'm assuming that means they're buffing up the chance for this to spawn. I tried to do a burn build or a damage over time fire build as my first build on Sorcerer, so it's cool to see that both of these like fire damage over time skills are getting some love. And then lastly, they increased the lucky hit chance for Meteor skills enchantment bonus. Meteor had a 3% chance that a meteor falls on enemies on hit. They're buffing this so that it should spawn more often. I was a little underwhelmed by the Meteor skill as someone who played a lot of like Meteor Wizard in Diablo 3. A little underwhelmed by Meteor, so it's cool that with this enchantment, it should be coming down more often. Next up, we get to UI. There's quite a few changes here, but the one that I think is the most important is for keyboard and mouse players. They've made it so that you can map a single button to move and another button to use your primary attack input. This is actually why I played the beta on controller, which I usually play all my ARPGs on mouse and keyboard, was because there wasn't a dedicated move button, which I personally did not like. They have now changed that. There will be a dedicated move button, which is really, really nice for like quality of life on mouse and keyboard. Next up, we've got some changes to encounters, and some of the biggest ones here are they've buffed the Butcher for World Tiers 3 and 4. The Butcher was killing a lot of players in the start of the game, World Tier 1 and 2, and they're buffing it so it'll be even more difficult for World Tiers 3 and 4. Players were starting to nuke the Butcher once they got builds online, so it'll be more difficult later on. Next up, certain bosses like Tchort, Malnock, and Vinard are being reevaluated for melee character difficulty, resulting in changes to their attacks and fight mechanics. These were some early game bosses that were just frustrating on melee characters. Those are getting changed, so maybe the Druid / Barbarian will have an easier time clearing them. Next up, we get to Cellars. Cellars were the mini dungeons that didn't really feel like they had a purpose. You would go into them. There was one room and some enemies. You'd kill them and just move on with your day. So they're doing some changes to those. To start us off, they increased the chance for a dungeon event to occur in Cellars. Cellars will now consistently reward a chest upon completion. So a nice little pop in to get some gear. I could see this being really nice early game. And then fix an issue where Cellars would prematurely be marked as complete, and fix an issue where the guaranteed elite monster would be absent from a cellar. So now Cellars should have guaranteed elites, dungeon events, and also a chest upon completion. They should be much more worth your time. Next up, we get to some general quality of life changes, and the biggest one here that I would actually be very curious to y'all's opinion on, because I was kind of sad to see this, is they've disabled the reset dungeon button. Previously in the beta, I, for example, was farming one dungeon over and over that I enjoyed the layout of. I thought it was a good dungeon, it had good mob density, and I would just do that dungeon, reset it, do that dungeon, and reset it, and I was using this to farm my loot. They've now disabled resetting dungeons, kind of period. And they have a developer note about this, which I'm going to read out. So while Diablo 4 Sanctuary is home to over 100 dungeons, the open beta only had the subset offered in Act 1's Fractured Peaks for players to explore, and a level cap that isn't a full representation of the experience at launch. There are many reasons to complete a variety of dungeons, including collecting powerful affixes in the Codex of Power, and players will still be able to repeat dungeons by partying up with others and having them start the dungeon. We also wanted to make sure that resetting the dungeon wasn't a way for hardcore players to avoid death when experiencing a challenge in a dungeon. Still, we know it can be fun to repeat a specific dungeon, and the team is looking at a more permanent solution to this, like having some reasonable cap on how many times the same dungeon can be completed in a row to better support that style of play. In fact, in the full game, players will acquire sigils that will unlock nightmare dungeons, which are specifically designed to be completed repeatedly and are optimized to be highly rewarding and replayable. We'll have more to share on this in the future. So basically, early game, you're not going to be farming the same dungeon over and over for gear and levels. That is a particularly easy dungeon, but it sounds like late game, you will be able to repeat dungeons. So more of an early game kind of XP stop in a way. And that is going to do it for the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I'm really excited to see some of these changes. I personally have had a pretty hard time deciding on what character I wanted to play. There's a difference in between the characters that I kind of want to start and the characters that are really strong. For example, I really wanted to play a Druid in this game, but I just wasn't going to go a Druid because they felt pretty terrible to me in the early game and just kind of a pain to level. So I love seeing some changes to that. I think the Sorcerer was heavily reliant on Chain Lightning as its easily best spell. So to see changes to that, I think is also great. Should open up more build diversity. The Barbarian should be a little bit stronger early game, and the Rogue's imbuement skills were just overtuned. I immediately as I was playing Rogue and I was using those shadow imbuements, I was this is one of the strongest skills, if not the strongest skill I've used in the entire beta. So the fact that those are getting their cooldowns changed, I think are all good changes. I know people don't like nerfs, but I think these will be good for the general build diversity and health of the player base. Not everyone picking one class, for example. So yeah, guys, good changes there. I hope you all enjoyed. Stay tuned for more Diablo 4 updates on the channel. I plan to be heavily covering this game, and I'll catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.